And you know what I feel at this point is that, we are beating a dead horse, like, in
I
terms
know, but
of
that's
making a
good.
strong case for one.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, people from different perspective, appreciate different types of arguments. So that's why I'm
yes,
trying to cover many
yeah, yeah, yeah.
different angles,
So when
inshallah.
we're beating that dead horse, like one part of it might satisfy one group of people, but not another.
Exactly.
And so then obviously if we continue to beat that horse, eventually the hope is that whoever's watching this, ultimately we
Mhm.
should cover everyone.
Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we are again back with the Gorap series. Inshallah, after completing G of the Gorap series on God's existence, we move into a new section entirely, which is Oneness of God, which is the O of Goraps. And inshallah, this is going to be very, very interesting because we have some very interesting arguments. And we have brother Yusuf Pondas again back with us on this channel. We welcome him again. Welcome to Incisive Thoughts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How you doing?
So before we move into the O of Goraps, we can give a very, very brief summary of what we covered previously. We, in three parts of the Goraps, part one, the G of the Goraps, part one, part two, and part three, we did establish a necessary being. We established that the necessary being has agency, has will. And then in the third part, we established that the necessary being has to be aware in some sense, is the foundation of all, is the foundation of morality in some sense. And then on top of that, we established that the necessary being has to be maximal in some sense. So all of the attributes of that necessary being has to be in the sense maximal. So from that perspective, we get a perfect being, because a perfect in the sense it would not have any deficiency or flaw. It's free from deficiency or flaw. Any deficiency or flaw itself would entail, it would create more problems than it would solve, because then you would, those arbitrary limitations, if anyone ascribes to it, requires more explanation. It does not explain what we started the whole series of explanation, like the whole motivation for that explanation. It cannot suffice for that. So from that perspective, perfect being theology is what we can establish, where that necessary being has to be a perfect being. Now there are many other arguments that can be added to make a stronger case, but I don't think it is necessary to dwell into it. Now there is one more thing that we have to cover, the O of Goraps, which should be the oneness of God. Why that being can only be one. So this is what we are going to cover, inshallah, in this section. And we're going to cover it on from many different levels. We might go on a fitri level as well, for cognitive science level as well. We might go on a religious level as well, like anthropological level as well, where why God has to be one and why cultures have recognized this oneness of God. And also on a philosophical level as well, why God has to be one, inshallah. So maybe we can start with the philosophical level first. And brother Yusuf Pondas, you can start with the first argument that you have in mind for why that being has to be one.
Yeah. So أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So the main sort of, I guess, philosophical one, well, there's a few, but we'll begin arbitrarily with whatever one pops into my head. Is that if you've got multiple gods, and they have differing wills, it's not an identical will, and therefore you've got no reason to even differentiate between them. If it's just multiple gods with distinct wills making different decisions, that if they come into conflict with one another, and you've got a binary where there's no in the middle. Yeah, it's not that there could be some type of concession between them. If you have this, it leads to a contradiction. And so, say you have God A and God B, and they make a decision about use of ponders, and they differ. And God A says that use of ponders should exist, and God B says use of ponders should not exist. The question is which one wins? They can't both do that. There's one that will overcome the other, in one way, shape, or form. If I do exist and God A says use of ponders exists, then that means God A has power. Yeah. If God B then tries to say Yusuf ponders does not exist and he tries to remove me from existence, the question is do I remain in existence or do I disappear? If I remain in existence, God B, by definition, is not all powerful and therefore not God. Yeah. And that God A is the all
Hmm.
powerful and the one that is in control of everything. And that God B is subservient to his decision. His will is subservient to his. And if it comes into conflict with God A, God B is powerless to overcome that. Yeah. However, if God B says that Yusuf Ponder should not exist and I cease to exist, that means God B is the true God and that God A is subservient to God B. And obviously, God A, B, A sort of already implies some sort of superiority, and the tags are arbitrary here. So we could maybe change it to like God Blue or God Red or whatever. Just it's a signifier for the sake of the argument. The letter itself is not supposed to indicate hierarchy. It's just so that we can distinguish between the two different um, subjects with distinct wills. And so, yeah, and the point is that like if I remain existing or if I stop existing, this would make it very clear and highlight which of the gods is the true God or which will
Hmm.
is the overpowering will. Yeah. Um, then there's the contradiction is that if you say that both of them are all powerful, then they can't. It's not possible for both of them to have their wills enabled if they differ. Yeah,
Hmm.
because it's not possible that I do exist and don't exist simultaneously.
Hmm.
Do you follow? So in
Right.
this, so that and basically what it's pointing out is that you cannot have two all powerful beings. Because if they both are all powerful and they come to disagreement in any way, shape, or form, that would lead to a contradiction and it would be an impossibility. And so it sort of highlights the idea of the absurdity of it because of the fact that you can't have these conflicting wills. And then there's further argumentations that you could make, where, for example, you highlight that you look into the universe and you see order, and you
Hmm.
see that everything. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying. So, yeah, that is a very fascinating argument that comes like what you mentioned. Like if there are two wills, either one would win over the other, right? And they cannot both like create a contradiction that either you exist or you don't exist. You cannot be both. So there has to be a manifestation of one will. So from that perspective, that I think Hamza calls this argument argument from exclusion from the divine reality. It's a very interesting argument. And there's one third possibility that, if I'm not mistaken, Hamza talks about. And what if there are two wills, like let's say there are two beings who are both omnipotent, but they both agree to let's say to come to one conclusion, which is that to bring you into existence or to keep you in existence. Then in the end, like this is the third option that someone can take in. But then the manifestation would be only one will. Now you're just claiming that there are two wills.
Yeah,
The manifestation is one, and then the second argument, which I think brother Hamza brings in, is the conceptual differentiation argument, where so if you are saying that okay, there is only manifestation of one will, but there are behind those one will are two beings, then you have to make a differentiation where why are they two different, and
yeah,
in what
yeah,
sense are
exactly.
they two different?
Yeah, because if
And
there's nothing that makes them distinct, then why are we calling it two wills? It is essentially just
exactly.
one will, and it becomes unnecessary to even posit the second. It's like
Right.
this is just silly at this point. If like every decision is identical, then there is no way to be able to even start counting. There's nothing that makes them distinct, which is another great point.
Right. Yeah, and within conceptual differentiation, like when we are talking about a necessary being and a perfect being, the perfect being has to be one. It cannot be more than one. And if you want to have a differentiation between the two beings, let's say, that differentiation would be arbitrary. If that is arbitrary, it cannot exist in the necessary being. So the necessary being, in that sense, the ultimate foundation of reality, has to be one. And when like there are many reasons why you cannot posit beyond one necessary being, beyond one perfect being who's the ultimate ground of reality, ultimate foundation of reality. Yeah, so maybe we can come back to this part later, but what you were mentioning, maybe we can skip to that and then come jump back to this one.
Yeah, yeah. So which one should we cover now then?
You were mentioning how if there were more than one wills, if I'm not mistaken, you were trying to cover that argument, right? Or did I
Yes.
already cover that?
No,
What you
so
were
that was the one
trying
we
to say?
just did. So if there's more than one, if there's more than one will, it leads to contradiction. And then
Right.
there's another one we could talk about in terms of um, Occam's razor.
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
Is that you don't need to start multiplying beyond necessity. Now,
Right.
if you can explain it with one, unless you've got a very, very, very good reason to start positing more than one, it's
Hmm.
unnecessary. Yeah. Um,
Right.
Obviously, if you've also got good reasons to reject a multiplicity, like what we've just mentioned, again, you
Hmm.
have more reason to just stick with one. And
Right.
this sort of links and ties as well to the sort of the fitri position that like,
Hmm.
and there's a really good set of interviews that Brother Khalid has done with another brother of ours called Jerry, who's a mutual friend. It's really good. It's on the origins of monotheism, and it touches on how monotheism can be traced to in each religion globally. And so like even if you look in the Vedas, for example, in the oldest books that they have, it begins with monotheism, and also, funnily enough, not worshipping idols. Yeah, no,
Hmm.
not creating idols and things like that. So, like how that develops to what we have today is obviously another topic. But the point is that you have these origins of monotheism globally, and naturally, people when in a situation where they're in danger, for example, in the Quran, it uses the example of a sinking ship. The modern example, John Fontaine did a really good video skit where he's in an aeroplane with an
Hmm.
atheist,
I've seen that.
and
Yeah.
the aeroplane's hits a bit of turbulence. That the natural inclination of humans or of mankind is to call out to one God, not to a
Hmm.
pantheon. And that what is what we would say is like the fitri position
Hmm.
in them recognizes that there is a creator, and that they instinctively turn to that and ask for
Right.
the help of the one who is in control, the originator.
Hmm.
And that is very, very, very easy for the vast majority of human beings when they're not in a position where they're trying to be argumentative. They're not arguing with anyone. Yeah, like in a position where your life is in danger. Yeah, like you're not going to sit
Right.
there and maybe which god. No, you turn to one god and you ask for the one that you think or you believe is in control. Yeah, the one that's going to be able to help you. Um, and that is very, very fitry. You mentioned you did a bit more research on the
Yeah.
fitry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you want to go
Yeah.
into that.
So yeah. So I actually recently wrote an entire article on something not exactly what we are talking about, but something related to that. Inshallah, I'll bring that article up and we can cover that. But before that, I just want to play one video. You might find this very interesting and ironic at the same time. So
Yeah,
just let me play that video, and that might segue us into a different topic altogether. But still, we'll try to be brief on that topic, but still, it's interesting. So let me play that video. Okay.
yeah,
Questions about
Mhm.
monotheism. What are the philosophical justifications for the preference of monotheism over polytheism?
So when you're looking at, again, like different concepts and different stories of ultimate explanations of reality. So let's start with the concepts. The concept of God is supposed to be of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so that's a very, so if you've got to compare that with some kind of like polytheistic story where there's a bunch of beings, maybe they're all equally perfect, maybe they're not equally perfect. I don't know. You're going to have to tell a story there. But a monotheistic story is a simpler hypothesis. When you are weighing different theories, there's a couple different things you want to look for. Explanatory power is very, very important. Can it explain all the phenomena that it's meant to explain? And say in a position where monotheism and polytheism both explain phenomena of the existence of the universe. Okay, cool. Well, now what do? Well, now you look for other theoretical virtues, like simplicity. Is it a simpler hypothesis? Does it posit more entities than it needs to in order to explain all of the phenomena? Well, monotheism is a simpler hypothesis, and it can explain all the phenomena without having to posit other divine beings. And so it's a simpler hypothesis than polytheism, so it's more likely to be true.
Can you just repeat the last sentence because of internet connection? You said it's simpler and then.
Oh, yes. So to repeat it, the claim is when you're looking at two different theoretical, when you're looking at two different theories and they have an equal explanatory power, you can move to different theoretical virtues to decide between the two. And the simpler hypothesis is likely to be true. Monotheism is a simpler hypothesis that can explain the existence of the universe. And so it's got the same explanatory powers as polytheism. We're granting that for the argument. But it's more simple because it doesn't posit extra entities beyond what's necessary to explain the phenomena. So it's more likely to be true.
Yeah. So just to sort of give you another example of why the simpler one is the better one. Let's say we're behind a castle wall and a rock flies over and hits the house. And we're like, where did this come from? Like and then two people come forward and one says there was a catapult. And this one catapult fired a rock and it went and it hit the house. And then another guy goes, no. There was 3 catapults. And one catapult fired it into the next one. And then that catapult fired it into the next one. And then that catapult fired it. And they managed to sort of piggyback all the way to destroying your house. Yeah. Like, okay, both of them have explanatory power. Both of them do explain how your house got destroyed by this big rock. But one is multiplying entities beyond necessity.
Right.
And it's like, well, why? Why have you posited 3?
Right.
What's the point of that? Like, it explains how the rock got here. But it just seems so like unnecessarily multiplied and in such an obvious fashion. And this sort of touches on now, like, go ahead.
Yeah, that is what I was saying. So the irony in this was, I felt there was an irony in this, which is that the person who was making this case was Dr. Ryan Mullins. He made a very a good case of why we need to prefer one entity more, rather than a multiplicity. But then, if you apply that consistently, that applies to the Trinity. Why not apply that to the Trinity as well? Like if one God can explain, if one being can explain everything, then why beyond necessity go into believing a son also, and let's say a Holy Ghost also? So from that perspective, what he said clearly was a simpler explanation is more likely to be true, which means is the Trinity unlikely to be true? I mean, that's the
inshallah point. He reflects on that, and may Allah guide him to Islam.
I mean.
But and that's a brilliant point. And especially when you have all of these sort of like excruciating problems, like the LPT, the logical problem of the Trinity. Like you've got very, very, very good reason to start questioning the necessity of this, this tritheism, which it always ends up being, although they deny it's tritheism. So I think it's a great point, and to sort of touch on things as well, because this sort of links a little bit now, so a secular critique of monotheism generally is they look at the historical record and they say, look, the historical record shows polytheism came first and monotheism developed later. Right. And the question is okay, so you're assuming that because when you look in the dirt and you find polytheistic temples, you find a number of things which give away that it was a polytheistic temple. You find idols. This generally comes at a point where writing has already been established, and you've got little bits and bobs which give clues to there being multiple deities. Because that's what they do. They create statues. They create evidence that can be found. Now, if you go prior to that, so you go to pre-written society, so they're not writing things down yet. They are monotheistic in their nature, and they are anti-idol. What are you expecting to find in their temples? You're just gonna if we go back and you've got a tribe, there's two type of tribes. You got the settlers, so the people who stay completely still, and then you have the nomads that move. So if they are creating a place of worship, like a room distinct specifically for the acts of worship, when you go in there, this is at a time where everything is verbal, so their stories are verbal. They're memorizing their traditions so that they can talk them, and it's through speech. What are you expecting to find? If this monotheistic civilization exists, and that is the origin, you're not going to find the kinds of archaeological evidence that you would do had there been idols and things like that, like you do with the polytheistic ones. So by its nature, it's going to be difficult to discover that archaeologically. And the lack of evidence that they're finding is not something that should suggest that monotheism didn't come first at all. In fact, if that was the case, if monotheism was, that's exactly what you would expect. You would expect it to be difficult to find archaeological evidence of it because of the nature of the type of religion that it is. Yeah.
We need to note one thing. It is often claimed that belief in one all-powerful creator God is a later development, that religion evolved from animism to polytheism to monotheism. But this narrative has collapsed. Even an introductory academic material has now acknowledged this shift. Previously, there was a widely held belief called the paradigm of evolutionary religious organization that suggested that societies naturally evolved from animism to polytheism to monotheism over time. This has since been largely disproven. And when we look closer, the problem becomes obvious. Evans posits that the theory that religion evolved from animism to monotheism is not based on evidence but on speculation, projection, and Western bias. He says, regardless of the specifics, however, one common feature is apparent in every one of these theories: they are pure speculation. And when it comes to prehistory, the confidence disappears entirely. As Matthew Broderick in Evolutionary Debunking mentions, that the overall balance of empirical literature and testimony suggests that the jury is still out on what prehistoric humans believed about gods. But more importantly, real world data hints a different story. As we can see, some of those who are working on ground actually admit, what I learned from the natives surprised me and shook my faith in Mr. Spencer's theory, with which it seemed incompatible. It is impossible to accept the theory that belief in an all-father is only reached in the course of such advance to a higher social organization. The on-ground evidence directly contradicts the evolutionary models. It is common to find among many primal people or recognition of the existence of a deity far up in the sky or at great remove, who has made everything, man, woman, earth, sea, and sky, and who at a distance sees all that goes on among them and sometimes disapproves but does not often interfere. Among groups like the Pygmies of Africa, the Fujians of South America, and the Australian bush people, the belief in such a high deity has been even cleaner and more definite. And one thing to note, that the Pygmies and the bush people of Australia and the Fujians are some of the oldest cultures in the world. No one is sure that the first worshippers were polytheist. In this regard, one should leave room for the possibility that monotheism arrived on the scene first and polytheism came later. It is conceivable, in other words, that humans first began worshipping, say, either a sky god or a mother goddess, and that the pantheon of gods and goddesses who populate polytheistic belief systems represent a later stage of development. There is a sky god in many belief systems, from example the Greek god Zeus and the Roman counterpart Jupiter. Over the course of time, other gods and goddesses came to be worshipped and the power of the original sky god contracted. This at least is a possible theory. And in this episode, inshallah, we will show that monotheism, not polytheism, is the more plausible beginning of human belief, and that polytheism may represent a drift away from the original clarity.
Yeah. And then even then, say again, you take them from a polytheistic, from a secular perspective, and they're talking about the development of polytheistic religions first. it doesn't even make sense from a secular perspective to suggest that polytheism came first, because if they start the process of creating a pantheon, they have to start somewhere. They're always, if they start putting divinity into things, there's always going to be the first thing that they put divinity into, and that is going to be one thing. Yeah, and so you begin with one God, and then if they're going to multiply, they'll do that in stages, and then the pantheon will be something that develops over time. So even by finding these pantheons, logically speaking, that pantheon has to have developed in stages. So first they see, oh, we've got this God, the God of love. Then, oh, we've got this other thing. This is the God of war. Oh, we've got this other thing. This is the God. So even if they're doing that, again, by necessity, it would be something that would develop in stages and not all in one go. It's like you can't even start a sentence describing a pantheon without having to mention the first one first. Yeah. So even within that, either way, that there's always this necessity to begin with one God before the multiplication starts to occur. I've got something else I want to add to that, but I don't know if you want to input anything.
So maybe I can add, maybe we can start with my article as well, and it will cover original monotheism as well, inshallah.
So I'll tell you what I wanted to mention next. The next thing I wanted to talk about was our explanation of how things may have developed into polytheism. Like So do you want me to wait until after you've...
Yes, so it might be incorporated within the article. You can jump in, and inshallah, we can both touch on that. Yeah, so this was a recent article that I wrote for IREP. IREP is basically Islamic research into exotic phenomena. It's a new group. Now, this article was primarily for those who, like, starting from a new age perspective, where people believe in other spirit beings, like, the spirits, or there are aliens that exist or whatever. So the primary purpose of this article was making a case for the oneness of God and God's existence for those kind of people and that kind of mentality. So I'm not saying that, okay, yeah, these beings have to exist. I'm saying, what if they exist? We still have to do the groundwork in that perspective. So this is where the article starts. No, I won't cover everything. I just start with how, let's say, like this student who come across, like, there are other supernatural beings that exist, imagine, or aliens exist or something like that. Now, how would he navigate monotheism, or there being one ultimate foundation of reality? And that is where I divide the article into like 5 sections. First is, right, from the fitri perspective, I try to deal with cognitive science. Second is from philosophical perspective, a necessary being perspective. Third is the anthropological perspective, inshallah, which would be very interesting when it comes to the development of original monotheism and the development of polytheism as well. Fourth is just in the Islamic perspective, which is not necessary for this discussion. And fifth is related to the grounding of truth itself. So first is talking about the human being and seeing the fitra, trying to use cognitive science to have some idea of the fitra of the human being. This is where Oxford researcher Olivera Petrovich talks about how children are naturally drawn to find ultimate explanations for reality, and they want the most simplest and ultimate explanation for reality. So they go into questioning about, like, why are we here, why is the universe here, into the origins of everything, and they want an ultimate and simple explanation. Now imagine, if they want an ultimate and simple explanation, this is their tendency. Polytheism is not the ultimate explanation, nor is it the simplest explanation. This is where monotheism fits better than polytheism. Then I move into some work by Dr. Justin Barrett, which is not relevant here.
Just to sort of jump in on that point briefly. So you made a great point in that polytheism isn't the ultimate explanation, nor is it the simpler. And like, you need to give very, 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 very good reasons as to why we should accept that over monotheism. In the same way, for example, let's say, we ask about the age of the universe. There's lots of evidence to suggest it's however many thousand billion years old it is. Yeah. And there's lots of good reasons that people have used in terms of empirical evidence to come to that conclusion. And let's say someone else comes along and then suggests that the universe happened, or it popped into existence 5 minutes ago. Yeah, they're both, philosophically speaking, possible. And then even in terms of like explanation of, oh, well, what about all this evidence to suggest it was longer than 5 minutes ago? What about my memories from before 5 minutes ago? There's a way the 5-minute-ist could explain that away and say, no, when it was created 5 minutes ago, all of the evidences and all of your memories, these are all false. They were created at the same time. And even the idea of there being evidence, that's not true. You've just been created 5 minutes ago with an idea that there is evidence that it was older. And yes, it's philosophically possible. And it's one of those sort of like irrefutable ideas. But the point is that simply because it's possible, that doesn't make them weigh equally. It doesn't make them weigh equally. You need to give me very, very good reasons to take this seriously above and beyond something else, which has much more weight on the scales of evidence. Yeah. And we can go and look into them and just assume for the sake of argument that the 5 minute one is possible, and then start to look into the evidences. And if you do, you will find there are some. And at that point, it's like, okay, so what evidence is there for you to believe that it was 5 minutes old? And it's like, oh, well, no, there isn't any evidence. It's just this hypothetical that you've put forward. And so at that point, I'm not going to take it seriously. Another more practical one is the murderer. You've got a lot of evidence to suggest this one guy murdered this person. And then someone kicks down the door. They're just about to like sentence the guy to death. And, you know, you've been found guilty and, you know, you're going to get 20 life sentences or you're going to get executed.
Right.
And all of the evidence suggests it's this one person. Like there's so much of it. You've got video, you've got his testimony admitting it. You've got, you know, a crowd of witnesses that saw it. You've got the murder weapon. You've got his fingerprints on the murder weapon. You've got motive. You've got blah, 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 blah. All the evidence points to this one guy. And then someone kicks the door down and goes, whoa, 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 whoa. What if it was a conspiracy of loads of guys? And there's like this team of people that brainwashed him into doing it. And then, and then they start positing all of these like extra details. And it's like, okay, that's possible. But what have you got as evidence for us to take that seriously now?
Exactly.
Nothing, but it's possible. It's like, I don't care. It's not as simple as just putting something forward as a possibility. Yeah, it's possible. But if you do not have strong evidence to suggest that we should take this possibility seriously, then I'm not going to treat it like it's equal to these other possibilities that have heavy evidence in their favor. And so the same, now we go back to like comparing now monotheism to polytheism. You have lots of good arguments, yeah, for the veracity of a monotheistic position, for Tawheed. And like polytheism, the vast majority of the time, it's just stated almost like, oh, well, the idea exists, as if that's enough to take it seriously. It's not. Give me an argument for the necessity of there being a multiplicity behind the divinity. Like, and I haven't seen it. I've not seen like a solid argument that suggests why multiplicity is necessary, why we should accept multiplicity above and beyond. The vast majority of the cases that I've ever come across tend towards this, oh, but you don't know, it's still possible. Ooh, yeah, and when I'm hearing it, it doesn't sound any different to the guy kicking the door down saying it's possible is a conspiracy of 50,000 people that brainwashed this dude, but you've got no evidence. Yeah, there's like,
Exactly.
that's it. It's you're just putting it forward as a hypothetical. I'm not going to take that as equal. It doesn't weigh the same.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And what I have been trying to do, what you said is very important, and from an inferential perspective, it makes a lot of sense how we compare different explanations and, you know, pick out the one that makes the most sense. What I'm trying to do within the first section is more about even non-inferentially what idea sits well within us. And I move into some other like, you know, papers that talk about how there's a bias, there's at least some bias that's there that drives us towards monotheism. This could be some link to the fitra, this could be something pointing to the fitra, why we believe one over many, in some sense as an ultimate explanation, why we believe in one God. We choose one God as an explanation rather than many. And there's some bias to it. If you look at all of our natural tendencies towards religion, a belief in a supreme being we are more biased towards that. Now, Dr. Justin Barrett himself highlights how one being having ultimate inferential potential is something that we are driven towards, and that could be an ultimate explanation of reality compared to other beings that we believe in, which might have localized and limited potential. Like, for example, I can believe in a spirit, like my pet spirit. I cannot say that that is the ultimate explanation of reality, because it has limited inferential potential. It can explain why, I heard some sound in the night, or I heard, my socks got missing or something along those lines. It can only explain that. It cannot take the burden of being an ultimate necessary being that can explain all of existence. So there's a huge distinction between, you come across any extraordinary being and the ultimate reality, like the ultimate foundation of reality, God, from that perspective. Now, that might not be necessary for us here, but yeah, again, one more thing is, so within the moral dimension, like signaling value, when it comes to that, again, believing in monotheism gives you a better grounding for objective morality, a better grounding for signaling in terms of how we all come together. It can unify us, and that's how we expect a kind of moral obligation that we all are obliged to in some sense. And this is, many anthropologists themselves talk about why monotheism grows faster than polytheism within society, is because of this unification and this idea where, if everyone has the same moral principle that they subscribe to, there's no relative uh, um, relative morality that works better within societies. Anyway, that again, we
Yeah,
don't have, we
and
need to
just
go there. Yeah.
to touch on that, this is something that was recognized as far back as like the early Greek period with Socrates. In the Republic, written by Plato, Socrates starts pointing out one of the issues with polytheism is when you have this multiplicity of gods, they tend to be very differing, and they go to war with each other, and they can be polar opposites of each other. And the issue is that if people are seeing these things as divine beings, as being closer to perfection than humans are, and they see these divine beings as doing actions, it's very easy for them to then make an inference to say, this is a divine being, his actions are therefore also divine. And if they're competing with each other and conflicting, you can say you've got like one god that's a bit more noble and another one that's a bit cowardly, or or one that cheats and steals and does naughty things, and you see this in all of the polytheistic religions. You have like the naughty gods, the ones that do like the tricksters. Like you have Loki in the Scandinavian religions. You've got Hades in the is it the Greek or the Romans? You've got these naughty gods that do naughty things. And the thing is if these gods are divine, the naughty acts are divine acts. And so people that look to the gods for guidance can see these naughty deeds as divine acts and want to emulate them as an act of emulating the divine. And it could be justified to that. And so Socrates even points this out. He says, this is a problem. Like, we can't, it's too confusing, because that's coming into conflict with what and he's making the argument from like a fitri position as well. He's like, it's clear that some of the things that these so-called gods are doing are problematic, and these are not things that we want people to emulate at all. That's not conducive to a good society. And so he's rejecting, and it's part of probably one of the big reasons that he ends up getting executed for because in the end they make him drink hemlock. They put him to death for rebelling against the religion of the ancestors. And he even in that starts to posit the idea of trying to figure out a way of getting people to move away from polytheism, from this multiplicity, and he even talks about and it's funny because he's obsessed with trinities, funnily enough, as well. And he talks about the human being tripartite. So you've got the lower self, you've got the rational self, and then you have the spiritual self. And then he even transposes that to society, and he talks about society being tripartite, and he talks about gold, silver, and bronze. And the gold are the leaders, the warrior class, and the silver. And so there's this idea of Trinity flowing throughout, and he talks about creating a grand lie And so like it's really, really, really funny. The heavy Greek philosophical influence on Trinitarian thought is massive. Like if you look at the early church fathers and a lot of the things that are being spoken about, where they're trying to sort of justify this multiplicity within the Godhead, the Trinity itself, there's a lot of reference to a lot of Greek thought, and you can see the influence of Plato seeping into their explanation. And then like you say, like why the whole idea that many Trinitarians are putting forward when they're arguing against polytheists, they become very sort of tawhid centric. Like if they're talking to people who are strict polytheists, where they do assert a multiplicity, they're like the Muslims. They're just tawhid, and it's about God, 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 God. It's not about the Trinity when they're arguing against polytheism. But then when they start arguing against the Muslims, all of a sudden this sort of like they end up saying similar things that the polytheists say to justify their polytheism. And it's funny that switch takes place, and it's like they're so close to Tawhid, especially when they're conceptually refuting multiplicity. But then there's this sort of cognitive dissonance that sort of seeps in when it comes to self-reflect on their own doctrine, which is interesting.
Right. Yeah. That's very interesting. And we can also pinpoint, if someone wants to go deeper into the Trinity, we can pinpoint to one course at Sapiens where Brother Jake explains how very deeply how the whole Trinitarian doctrine, how it was linked to Platonism, Neoplatonism, etc. There's some links there. But anyway, regardless, then within the first section also, one more very important thing that I cover is wide convergence on God, which is where I'm looking at some of the research done by Matthew Braddock. He makes this common consent argument for theism, where he talks about how so many numerous different independently done and other surveys on what do people believe about God in today's time right now, and we come to about 90% believe in a creator, singular creator God, or something like a supreme being, like something like the basic the minimalistic theistic concept about a God who created everything. So even if people coming from different religions, they converge to that. People from polytheistic religions might also come to something like this. There are some Buddhists. There was Professor James Kelly Clark who was once explaining how Buddhists who have a theology which does not believe in God, there's not a creator God within their theology altogether. Yet, ironically, 40% Buddhists in the world, even if they believe that theology and their theology does not allow for a creator God, they believe in a creator God.
Yeah.
So this is again very powerful. It talks about the fitra of the human being, where it drives us towards something closer to monotheism rather than these kind of polytheistic explanations. So which is quite remarkable if more than 90% of the world across multiple surveys come to the same conclusion that we believe in one creator God or something like a creator God, something close to a monotheistic idea of God, then that's questionable. Why is that the case? And this presses back on our fitra, because if there is this, the whole point of the first article is not making an inferential case for monotheism, but rather showing that the starting point of the human being and the natural tendency of the human being moves towards monotheism. So it's more about the natural tendency without inferentially thinking much. Still, like inferentially thinking much in the sense I'm trying to clarify that without you being a philosopher or something, like you coming up with a necessary existence and he has to be one and all.
Yeah.
Naturally, like a grandmother in Africa also, like if you just say if God is one or many, she would say God is one, and that is where she does not have to do jumping hoops of philosophy. It's more fitri, it's more innate to her.
Yeah. And these multiplicities tend to have very complex stories behind them, and it's like there's no way that anyone is intuitively going to come up with these stories. Like that's something you have to be taught in order to get to that point where you're thinking about things in this way. And if you're not taught them, you have to create it. And so like, if I'm telling stories to my children, I get creative and I might say XYZ I might create a character and say these things. Now, if for whatever reason, these kids take that too seriously and say I die before I can like let them know, oh no, by the way, I made all of that up. or if let's say I'm not that bothered about telling them why I made that up, they may grow up believing these things to be true, but then that's something that they've had posited into them, or it's something someone has manufactured. Yeah. Whereas you can look at the world, you can engage in the world, and you don't need to manufacture a story. You can just intuitively recognize that and if you keep in mind the arguments that we made at the beginning, a lot of these you don't need the philosophical language. So there's a lot of people that can look at the stars simply and be in awe of the majesty of creation and recognize there's a higher power. And that's the most common position. And there's a lot of people leaving religion now, but and the atheists try to use this and go, oh, look, yeah, we're growing. Yeah, atheism is growing, but a lot of people that leave religion do not become atheists. A lot of people become spiritual, but not religious. And it's very rare I find someone that's a hard atheist. Most of the people that reject religion that I've spoken to, I'm not saying you don't get the atheists at all. You do.
Right.
But you get a lot of people that still believe in a higher power. They go, no, there has to be, they use this language,
Exactly.
there has to be a higher power.
Exactly.
There has to be something that's in control of everything. Like it's so ingrained in the human being that even if they reject religion, they can't necessarily let go of that monotheism, that tawheed that's there. And it's very rare that when someone rejects religion, they go, oh yeah, no, there has to be like this multiplicity of gods. I've never once heard that. I've never heard anyone reject a religion, but then maintain some type of like polytheistic belief. They always say higher power, singular, not, oh, there has to be some type of higher powers. I never hear that word being used in the plural sense, which is, I think is very, very important to take a note of.
Right. Moving on, the second section is more about the contingency argument itself, that within that, there was one section that I cover, which was making a case for there only being one necessary being. So this was, once the argument reaches a truly necessary being, the idea for multiple such beings quickly loses its grip. A necessary being is not merely, it's very small to read. It's not merely very powerful. It is the ultimate source upon which all else depends. And as such, it cannot be the sort of thing that whose existence or character still calls for a deeper explanation. When we have more than one being, that might call for a deeper explanation. And there's more people can read it. I'm not going to cover that. We can just directly move into the third section, which is the most interesting. Yeah. So the third section is the anthropological witness, which is where we talk about, I talk about the high God motive. You can skip all of this. It's like, many monotheistic traditions believe in angels and, fallen angels and the unseen beings, etc. And they are open to that. So just because extraordinary beings exist does not mean that has to necessarily challenge monotheism. But that's not our topic, so I'm going to skip that. The high God motive, this is very important. This is what we have to touch on. So this is where, before even if I start this discussion, let's talk about something very interesting. Why did we come up, within academia, we come up with an explanation of, first it was animism and then polytheism and then monotheism, though there are some other stages in between as well, is because there was one person, his name was E.B. Tylor, and this was the time where evolution as a theory was very popular, animal evolution and all of those kind of, Darwin's theory was very popular, and it was being extrapolated in many other disciplines. This is where E.B. Tylor, who came up with the idea, a very bizarre idea, that human beings, the first human beings, they were having they were having dreams or something, and then they thought they're real or something along the line. That's how animism came in, and from animism polytheism came in, and from polytheism monotheism came in. I won't go that. It is very well refuted in academia now. Even those who don't believe that the first religion was monotheism, they refute all of those kind of theories. And now many academics, they show how this kind of stepwise evolution from animism to polytheism to monotheism is a refuted theory. You cannot make sense of that, because there are counter evidences that are there, where wherever you look at tribes who you think are believing in animism, at the same time they have a high God concept, or they had a high God concept. So if there is a high God concept, that's already, the high God concept is basically believing in a supreme being who created everything, and he's the most high.
Even though Quraysh, they had this multiplicity in gods, But then when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would speak to them about Allah, they had a recognition that Allah was the ultimate creator, and they sort of saw all of these lesser gods as intermediaries as such.
Right.
And so again, like, they were polytheistic, but they still had the concept of an ultimate creator, the originator of all things, and that was essentially what was in control of everything and was the most high, the most powerful, etc.
Right. Right. So, so again, this idea is refuted. So what I would suggest also, there's one more idea that people used to have is the earliest human beings did not believe in God, and that is also refuted. And I would reference, if someone wants to go through it, there's one chapter by Matthew Braddock in the book that I will show on the screen, which actually destroys this idea of polytheism was the starting point, or no belief in God was the starting point. Both are destroyed in that article. So it's very interesting. In that chapter, it's very interesting. But now where he stops is that academia does not have any means to deduce what was the first religion, because we don't have any method. Wherever we find animism, we are also finding polytheism. We might also find a high God concept, and all of this is together. If it is all of that is together, you cannot say that this developed from that or that developed from this. So academia currently is at a position where they don't have a clear stance what came first, because they don't have a clear method. They're saying we don't have a method, but yes, there is one method that still exists, and this is where the high God motives comes in. Is that if we have a method, if we have a valid method to deduce which religion was the first religion for mankind, then maybe we can if we have a method, then we can deduce, okay, what came first, if it was a high God concept that came first, or animism came first, or polytheism came first. This is where there's one very well-known scholar named Wilhelm Schmidt. He wrote volume of 11,000 pages, if I'm not mistaken, of doing research in all of the different cultures. And he did not come up with a method. It was a secular method that was developed, which was known as the culture historical method. And the culture historical method is basically looking at human cultures, our cultures, and seeing which is the oldest culture, which has retained its, which has not changed much. So if you want to see what was the first human culture, you might look at those cultures that have not changed much. So he divides cultures into four types. One is a primitive culture, one is a primary culture, secondary, and tertiary. So we all we have evolved, it's evolved in the sense we have changed so much, developed technology, civilization, all comes in the last categories. Whereas many hunter-gatherer tribes, they have a difference between them also. Some of them who did not change much, they are always consistent with their original culture. They come in the primitive category. Now, within the primitive category, when we investigate, it is very interesting that these people, many cultures, primitive cultures, believe in a high God. They understand that the high God created reality. And some of them believe that our ancestors only used to believe in the high God, but now we are starting to believe in these kind of lower spirits or lower beings, whatever, and we sometimes seek help from them. But overall, many of them have this belief that only a high God is the creator of the world. These beings might help simply here and there, but overall only that being is the creator, the maximal being, the supreme being. And they sometimes even give attributes like being eternal, being the creator, being the whole foundation of morality, etc., etc. So this is where I was. You had to say something.
Yeah. So this as well. So when people are looking at these multiple God ideas, and they'll, for example, in Buddhism, in certain forms of it, like the one that I went to in South Korea, they had this concept of the four heavenly kings, and each of them had a type of perfection that the other did not. And then they were different. So one was the all-seeing, another was the all-hearing, another was the all-powerful, and so on and so forth. So there's limiting factors for each of them. They're not ultimately perfect. And then again, this sort of question comes in. It's what is it that's determining that this one is deficient in one sense but perfect in another, or that one's deficient in a different sense and so on, perfect in another? And so when you have this, where you have these incomplete beings, that they're not fully perfect and therefore not perfect at all, what is it that's what is it that's drawing the limits for each of them? And then again, it sort of pushes you and necessitates to something, the higher God, that has the perfection of everything and is able to delineate limits between the things below it. That is
Right.
those things of creation that are subservient to him. And ultimately, if these things all have limits, they are not worthy of worship in any way, shape, or form. Whereas the one that is delineating those limits is the one that you should turn to, because they're in need of him as well. So why worship things that are
Exactly.
subservient to the higher God? And it's the same thing. So like when
Yeah.
people are putting these sort of limits on it, again, it pushes you to believe in the higher being as well. So back at the beginning when we mentioned God A, God B, and the competing wills and things like that, and you have this idea of, well, what if they don't need to be perfect, or what if they are both limited, and one time this one overcomes, God A overcomes God B, and then another time God B overcomes God A, and it's like, okay, well, if that is the case, there's these limits, these fluctuating limits, which push again and necessitate that there must be a third being above both of those two that is
Right.
delineating these limits between them and causes that flux that they themselves are not in control of. And therefore, they are not the most powerful, or they are not the all-powerful. They're not the one in control. There's something else that allows for that oscillating power structure to occur.
Right. And I believe that reminds me of something very interesting. Maybe I can bring on stage. So whenever I do research on many polytheistic religions, I think this was one particular continent, if I'm not mistaken, or some where Jan Assman is I think he's an Egyptologist. He's talking about many of the polytheistic cultures. The idea of a highest god who rules as a king over world of gods is common to all polytheisms of the ancient world. As you mentioned, this reminds me of very interesting thing that in the end, even if you have the most polytheistic systems, you have to believe that there's one ultimate king. And I think that also brings me of another book that I was reading. It was by Lee Kirkpatrick, if I'm not mistaken, and he was from a cognitive science perspective. He was saying how human beings have this dominance hierarchy and a kinship hierarchy, where wherever you have a whole system, you have to have one ultimate supreme king or something. So within polytheist system, there is much high tendency uh, to come up with something like an ultimate king or something,
Yeah, like
now.
you have Odin in the Nordic traditions. You have Zeus. You have so you've always got these sort of like leader ones. But then even then, these king gods that they have themselves were born. So like Odin had a father, and so there was a time he didn't exist, and that
Right.
his existence came into being because of something else that started that whole thing. And you go back and you have this sort of like foggy concept of an ultimate originator, which seems to
Exactly,
be
yeah.
closer to what we understand in terms of like the monotheistic God. But then they create such a distance between them and the originator of all things, and they put this hyper focus on created beings, these characters, these archetypes, like Thor, like Odin, like Zeus, like Hercules, and so on and so forth. And in these stories, in them, that it seems they there's such a long period of time they put focus on these lesser beings. You can see that they start to forget about the originator. They start to
Exactly.
forget, and they've got some stories about the originator, and they sort of talk about it, but because they're so hyper focused on things that they can make with their own hands and visualize and see, that creates this distance. It also shows the wisdom of the anti-idol mentality, because it sort of drags people slowly into ignorance of the originator.
Right. Subhanallah.
Their
That was
obsession.
a brilliant point. I actually covered that in my article, very briefly. So before I move into that section, which is very interesting, just one thing to highlight, which is also very interesting. So I had interviewed Dr. Winfred Kodeman, who's the top scholar, or one of the top scholar on original monotheism. He makes a case for that. People can have a look at the video itself, or they can even read his book, which is see, which you can see here. Now, within this book, he makes a very bold statement of regardless how one explains the origin of human beings, one cannot get around the fact that the first religion of human beings was monotheism, the recognition and worship of one God. And he uses William Smith's work and it uses some other examples to show how, if you want to trace back the first culture of human being, it does point to original monotheism, and also it points to a moral criteria that is very similar to the Abrahamic faiths. He makes a case for that as well. So the original culture of humankind would be monotheistic and have a moral structure, a moral order, which is very similar to the Abrahamic faiths that we see. That is an argument that he makes. Now, then, how does polytheism come in? If we try to go back to where we were within the article, we see that, like, works of like Nian Smart and many others, David Noss, they talk about how, like, Nian Smart talks about within Africa, many tribal cultures and many cultures, they actually have an idea of a supreme being, of one creator God. As you mentioned, even if it is not very distant, they still have it. David Noss, I think, he was doing a survey on Australian cultures and stuff like that, and he came that without an exception, even in Australia, there is one, within all cultures, there's like, if you go back, you see that there's one ultimate
The King of
creator God
Kings.
that was there.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's more from Africa. Then I use some examples by Dr. Patrick. He has a very simple article and he explains how within the Indian subcontinent there was the Santal people used to believe on one creator. Then within China there was Shangti. The even we you go back way in the past, there was you see these ideas of supreme creator. You see same within South America, you see same within North America, these kind of Indians, red Indians also. Way back in the past, their culture used to believe in one supreme creator. And many of their attributes also sometimes match with the what we believe in, that the idea of God. Sometimes they don't necessarily have to always be exactly
They
the same.
incline towards perfection.
Exactly. And then many islands, the Polynesian islands, you find many cultures over there. And when you go back to their genealogy, you see the belief in one creator. Brother Jerry Uxa highlights many different examples. But if you go back and see, okay, now there's one thing very interesting before moving into the next section, which is that let's take all of the civilization. We don't have much record of the past, as you mentioned. We just know some of, like, the ancient civilization, and that is where we have some good amount of records. Prior to that, it's blurry. So when we look at any civilization, Brother Jerry makes a very brilliant case showing how every civilization, let's take the Egyptian civilization. We had recently done a video which showed how within the Egyptian civilization, its origins, it's a bit tough to make a case, but you still see remnants of monotheism there. Then if you go back into the Chinese civilization, within that, the most sacred, the most oldest text of the Chinese civilization prior to Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, they used to believe in a supreme being, which was Shangti. Then, if you go back in the, let's say, Sumerian civilization, Brother Jerry points out how the number of gods, the more you go back, the number of gods are decreasing to the point where finally you reach two or one god, which shows how his number of gods increase how with time in civilization.
Which is exactly what I said at the beginning. That you would expect that even if there is a polytheistic religion, even from a secular perspective, if you just posit that all of this is completely manufactured, that you have to begin with one and then you multiply. You go, this God does this, then this God does that. You can't begin a polytheistic religion with polytheism. You start counting one at a time and you describe one. Even when you say a sentence that includes multiple gods, you have to name one God first, then you have to name the next. And that's just the nature of how polytheism could ever come to be, that you've got to begin with one God and then you move on to the next, which is exactly what we were saying.
Subhanallah. Yeah, so now if I go back and, this is also very interesting section that I cover, is not all encompassing, but some of the reasons that we have for why is it even the case that, people move from monotheism to polytheism. Before getting into the reasons, we need to note, generally within a monotheistic tradition, it isn't just God that people believe in. Dr. Winfred Kodewan says, we should not think that monotheism must exclude recognizing the reality of other spiritual beings. If the meaning of monotheism were the belief that God is the only spiritual being in the universe, that would be a seriously wrong definition, out of keeping with normal usage of the word. In my personal conversation with Dr. Winfred Kodewan, he actually said, out of all of his research, he's never found a single monotheistic tradition that never believed in any kind of other supernatural being, be it angels or any kind of other supernatural being. Gavin explains much of the debate depends on definition. To avoid confusion, he provides a very helpful illustration. And I want to build on his illustration with a few updates to make this as simple as possible. So we need to think of monotheism and polytheism as terms on a spectrum. Within monotheism, you can have on one end strict monotheism, where there's only one God that is worthy of all devotion, and there's no other worship allowed for any other spiritual being, where worship is restricted to only that being. On the other hand, you have inclusive forms, I like to call them loose forms, where there is one single supreme God, but lesser beings may exist as intermediaries or channels. On the polytheistic side, you can also have variation. You can firstly have democratic polytheism, where the gods are more or less equal in status. And then you can have, on the other end, hierarchical polytheism, where there is a clear structure with one high god above the rest. Now, if you see the full spectrum right in the middle of all this, the line begins to blur. Inspiring philosophy highlights this through this Venn diagram, and we can see clearly how there is a transition from some form of loose monotheism to hierarchical polytheism might become a seamless blend. So this implies a monotheistic tradition need to implement strict monotheism, or else in the long run it has potential to transition into polytheism. Now let's move on to some of the mechanisms how monotheism becomes polytheism. This is where Andrew Lang in his book The Making of Religion explains quite brilliantly. He says a moral creator is in no need of gifts. Ghost and ghost gods, on the other hand, in need of food and blood, afraid of spells and binding charms, are a corrupt but to man a useful constituency. Man being what he is, man was certain to go a whoring after practically useful ghost gods and fetishes. For these, he was sure in the long run first to neglect his idea of his creator, next perhaps to reckon him as only one, if the highest, of the venal rabble of spirits or deities, and to sacrifice to him as to them. And this is exactly what happened. What he's trying to imply is that man can have this tendency to look for some shortcut in terms of asking help from some other lower being. And in the long run, if this happens for long, they start neglecting the idea of the creator. Now, there are many other reasons that we can look at. Let's highlight a few of them. So one is what Brother Jerry Coughlin highlights, which is over focus on transcendence. So if a culture is overly focusing on the transcendence aspect of the supreme being, whereas it's not focusing more on the mercy and nearness aspect of that being, then creator might feel very distant, like the supreme being might feel very distant and irrelevant. Jerry Coughlin highlights that over focus on transcendence of God and lack of focus on his mercy and nearness, which he says this is also found in many Chinese texts, highlights how people start neglecting the creator and move to more accessible gods. Anthropologists suggest that this god has become so distant and exalted that he has in effect been replaced by lesser spirits and more accessible gods. So to Schmidt's theory goes, in ancient times the high god was replaced by more attractive gods of the pagan pantheon. And next we can look at is intermediary inflation. This is where we can focus on how people introduce saints, spirits, ancestors, and sometimes if let's say a culture is loosely monotheistic and focus is increasing on these intermediaries like saints and spirits, then in the long run the focus can shift so much and they are elevated to the point they are being considered as gods, and they may become objects of worship altogether. Humans may shift their worship to gods or lesser scope, but perhaps of greater psychological appeal. For example, from a rather distant, morally demanding god to the quite permissive, colorful, nearby, and abundant gods of the ancient pantheons. Another possibility is attribute fragmentation. One god has multiple aspects, multiple attributes, but in the long run, if those attributes, the minds of people get fragmented, they can become gods of their own. Like, for example, God is the one who's behind rain, God is the one who's behind fertility. But in the long run, if you fragment that, then the rain god becomes something different, the fertility god becomes something different. Elsewhere, men seem to have begun with a dim and faint appreciation of a single mysterious power in the world without them, and to have gradually divided this power up into various manifestations, which by degrees became separate and distinct beings. The process in this case might start after a few steps had been taken, or it might be carried on almost interminably until a pantheon had been formed in which the mind lost itself. Another possibility is mythologization, where historical figures and cultural heroes and their legends are saved in and orally transmitted. But in that transmission, a lot of exaggeration happens to the point where those are glorified to the point where they are considered gods in some sense, or they are deified in some sense. Another one which is very important is political plus social utility. Kings use religion, and multiple gods can be multiple power centers, and that could be an easier form of control than strict monotheism. Another point to highlight is when an empire expands, if the empire is expanding, there are many cities that are being covered, and every city, let's say, has a monotheistic god. It could be that now, because the empire expands and all of those gods are considered in some sense, though they might be the same god but called with different names in different cultures, that could turn into a pantheon of gods in some sense. Let's have a look at this brilliant video by Dr. Justin Barrett.
Other way, I mean, in the recorded history, we do know something about the relationship between monotheism and polytheism, though, or at least what looks like it. And it goes the opposite direction. So why did, I mean, lots of us have read at least classical literature, and you say, well, there are all these gods, the pantheon of the Greeks and Romans. Well, part of the reason for the pantheon is because you had empire. But their strategy for empire wasn't, okay, now you have to adopt our God. It was like, okay, you have your God, and we'll just add them to the list. And that actually seems to be more the default move, right? This is why you have so many gods in India as well. The default move seems to be just adding gods. But that doesn't mean you started with lots of gods. It means you probably started with a very small number of gods. You just kept adding them as you sort of, oh, hey, you've got a god too. I'm not sure it's the same as ours. Okay, well, we'll just add them to the list.
So this is also an important avenue that is possible. Whenever we can trace back polytheism to its early stages, we can find it results from combinations of monotheism. Each city appears to but have one god belonging to it, to whom others were added. Similarly, in Babylonia, each great city had its supreme god. One more possibility, which is ritual drift and bad transmission. Sometimes, in some cultures, it could be that practices remain, but the theology fades. It could be a result of people performing rituals without understanding core of the theology. If there is over extra emphasis on ritual, but the theology is forgotten, it can completely change the culture. And the next possibility would be a bad transmission, which is that if human beings are bad at transmitting the theology, that theology can change at some point and turn into something completely different. So it is at least plausible that many religions are based on authentic revelations, as God has communicated with the limits of human comprehension and as his message has been misunderstood and erroneously transmitted. There's one more we can cover, which is anthropomorphizing inanimate objects. Human beings do have a tendency to anthropomorphize inanimate objects, and that could be a means to create more entities that can later turn into a pantheon. Have a look at this video.
I'd say monotheism predates polytheism. What I would say is that polytheism is a degeneration of monotheism. And I think all that the research has shown by some of the research down there has shown that humans have a tendency to believe in superstition and anthropomorphize the natural world, yes, but it doesn't mean the natural world doesn't exist just because humans anthropomorphize. The sun exists, even though people used to think it was a man or a woman, or that the sky was made of a woman, which was the Egyptian belief. But it doesn't mean that the sky doesn't exist and the sun doesn't exist. It means that humans have incorrectly anthropomorphized the natural world, and they've also incorrectly anthropomorphized God. But people come to the conclusion of God because God is the rational conclusion based on the problem of causality. The point I really wanted to raise today is, man didn't really create God. God created man, and man created idols. And we shouldn't throw God out with the idols. Okay? They're different things.
Now, there's one more thing that we need to keep in mind, which is to recognize that the reverse trajectory can also occur. History also shows movement in the opposite direction. It is not necessarily the case that it has to always move from polytheism to monotheism. It could be in the reverse pattern as well. And such transitions are pretty complex to unpack. From a comparative perspective, at various times, religious cultures display a remarkable confusion, as for example, early trends towards monotheism are reversed and lush polytheism is reasserted, while elsewhere, well defined gods recede into unconscious spirits, only to have both trends later be reversed. In this sense, anthropologists are not entirely mistaken when they observe cultures converging towards monotheism or some other form. Such transitions do occur. At times, societies that were once polytheistic undergo a revival of reorientation towards monotheism or something like it. This is not random, nor is it without any cause. It could be a religious revival or any other reason. There are some practical reasons as well. As civilizations grow into size, complexity, and diversity, certain pressures begin to emerge. A fragmented system of many localized gods often struggle to provide the unity, moral coherence, and large scale coordination that expanding societies require. In contrast, monotheism offers a single moral authority, a unified framework of law, and a shared entity that can transcend tribal and cultural divisions. These features make it practically suited for larger, more complex societies. For this reason, in many historical contexts, the return to monotheism may become a functional need. It becomes a way to restore order, coherence, and unity at scale. Scholars like Aaron Naranzian in his Big Gods point out that when more unified conceptions of God enter polytheistic settings, they often begin to outcompete them. The reason is simple. Big gods, like a single all-powerful God, offers great moral coherence, stronger accountability, and a shared framework that scales with growing societies. There's something more compelling about the idea of one God that is in control, is giving blessings or controlling destiny. So what we see is not a fixed trajectory, but movement in multiple directions, where from the very beginning of human history to the peak of civilization, monotheism remains a viable possibility. At the same time, we need to be careful not to oversimplify this. Culture and religious evolution is extremely complex. Societies do not all follow a single fixed trajectory, nor do they move in neat, predictable stages. What we are offering here is not an universal law or an exhaustive explanation, but a set of possible patterns and mechanisms that help us make sense of some of these shifts. There are always multiple factors at play, many of which may lie beyond what we have considered here. And this is how polytheism crops in, one of the reasons why it crops in. However, there's one thing interesting within that, is that, as you had mentioned, and this is very interesting, even Dr. Winfred Cordovan and brother Jerry highlights, is that yet within some of these tribes, if they still have, if their idea of a creator God is still not completely forgotten, what would happen is, in emergency situation, in a situation where there is life and death, even if they believe in some limited beings, however, what kind of beings they believe in, whatever imaginary or like some statues that they venerate to them, when calamity strikes, they actually go back to asking, seeking help from that one God, because intuitively or within a fitri perspective, they believe that only the unlimited can provide this help in these situations. And we have one example of a tribe within Kenya where they believe in spirits and other beings, like, their ancestor spirits and whatever. They believe in that, they ask help from them. But then when a storm comes in, when a drought comes in, they understand that these beings cannot help. So they go back to worshipping the single creator, and they also invite other beings, or they say that, everyone, even if there is other beings that are existing, they have to also go back in worshipping this creator, because only in this situation, only this ultimate creator can help. And you see the same within some places in China, where they go back to worshipping the Shangti, even if they have forgotten Shangti, which was the ultimate creator. You also see in some European areas where polytheists, when they go in Brother Jerry highlights, when they go in this kind of situation of life and death, they again go back to worshipping one God. So that's an interesting avenue that we can take. We see that in many polytheistic cultures, they go back to worshipping one God or asking help from one God. Even in atheistic environments, if the plane is about to crash, we can see this in our times also. When the plane is about to crash, people, even if they say there's no God, they start believing in, oh God, please help me, oh God, please help me. This does happen. So that's a fascinating avenue. One interesting video comes to my mind is, Brother Muhammad Hijab had a discussion with Pearly, if I'm not mistaken, what her name is, who was with one very famous woman against feminism. She talks a lot about that. So Muhammad Hijab asked, like, when you are in a desperate situation, who do you ask help from? The Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit? She's a Christian. She's like, no, just God. And she's just God at that moment, or something along the line. This does highlight that when we are in these situations, our fitra ignites, and when we realize our ultimate creator, that only the one beyond the many who is the supreme me, only he can provide help. So that's an interesting avenue that we can take within human anthropology, that we see these pockets where many cultures, it's a recurring pattern, not all the time, but many cultures do highlight something like this, where we go back to worshipping that one single ultimate creator, even if we believe in polytheist, even if we have a polytheistic idea. Yeah, so that is what I try to cover. You're I think on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah, mashallah. Yeah, so I think so just to sort of, I think it'd be a good place now to sort of go back and just summarize the points that we've made so far. So we've talked about how there being a multiplicity leads to contradiction, or to the affirmation of one being the ultimate over the other. We talked about the simplest explanation, or the Occam's razor. There's no need to multiply entities without necessity. We've spoke about how even if multiple hypotheses are quote unquote possible, that if one has heavier evidences and argumentation in favor of it over the other, you don't need to take the other seriously until they present to you something that gives you reason to accept it, and also to offer refutation of the strong arguments in favor of monotheism. We spoke about the origins of monotheism being present in all nations, in all religions around the world. We spoke about how, even from a secular perspective, you would not expect to find archaeological evidence of a pure monotheistic religion that is against idol worship prior to written language, and so on and so forth. We've also spoke about what else? What have I missed? Anything? So the higher God concept being present in all of them.
Yeah, we can speak about how believe in one God and ultimate, and the most simple explanation is non-inferentially also more intuitive than the other explanations.
Yeah,
we
that
also
is
spoke
very
about from a morality perspective,
Yeah.
moral dimension as well.
Yeah, so even
we
the idea that we mentioned. So I gave the example of Plato recognizing this as well, that you have the naughty gods, quote unquote, but if the naughty gods are gods, their acts are seen as divine, and people emulate that. So even like in certain places around the world, you'll have temples dedicated to dark gods that do dark things. These are the gods of revenge, and if you want to get someone, or if you want to get your revenge upon someone, you'll go to this other god, and you'll make these sacrifices and do this stuff and that stuff, and like it's so you've got these other things, if you want to cheat, or so on and so forth, that could be justified through the acts of this particular naughty god, that kind of stuff, or lying as well, because you've got acts of certain gods lying or being manipulative.
This is actually a brilliant point, as I said by Brother Yusuf, and we can expand on this. Robert Garland comments on the moral nature of gods within many polytheistic systems. He says, are the gods good? The question might seem presumptuous, but it's not. He gives a quite colorful description of some of these evil gods, and then he says, all of them are jealous, vengeful, unpredictable, selfish, tricky, egotistical, and cruel. You worship these gods because they are powerful, and it can be extremely dangerous not to do so. Unsurprisingly, they aren't invested in promoting goodness. How could they be? They don't abide by any standard of morality themselves. In polytheism, gods incorporate and are responsible for both good and evil. In monotheism, God tends to promote goodness. So basically, if there are many gods, then polytheism produces multiple moral centers. If these moral centers contradict each other, then you have no single objective standard. In that sense, polytheism cannot ground ultimate moral law. Multiple divine wheels contradicting each other entail moral fragmentation. So within polytheistic morality, what is good? What is evil? Do we actually know the difference? Monotheistic religions are for the most part clear-cut about the distinction. Polytheisms, by contrast, although they also distinguish between good and evil, tend to be comfortable with moral ambiguity. Jack Skasher explains, one God means that there is one standard for moral and ethical living, one moral code whose source and authority is one God. By contrast, multiple gods mean multiple divine wills, espousing multiple and contradictory obligatory moral codes. He contrasts the above with the Babylonian code of Hammurabi, commissioned by the pagan god of justice. The sun god Shams had a different take on this subject. The law of justice was applied differently to a nobleman than to a commoner. This highlights polytheism may also lack grounding for equality and ultimate justice. Polytheistic justice turns out to be hierarchical and inconsistent, whereas monotheistic justice is universal and equal. Paganism posited the existence of multiple father gods who governed different facets of the world. These were authoritative deities of separate and different families of people. Each god had its own followers, and since the god of one people was considered superior to the god of another people, their respective followers felt themselves justifiably superior to the other. It is important to note that one's theology profoundly shapes one's moral perception. When the divine is conceived in a particular way, inevitably influences what is seen as right, wrong, virtuous, and blameworthy. In many polytheistic systems, the gods are often portrayed as jealous, vengeful, unpredictable, selfish, deceptive, egotistical, and at times even cruel, with little concern for the consistent promotion of moral good. If such beings are taken as exemplars, or if their edicts are taken as morally authoritative, then this can lead to deeply problematic ethical frameworks. Dr. Celine Ibrahim explicitly takes this into account in her central argument. I consider how deluded beliefs about gods lead to faulty moral actions and detail how appropriate understanding of the nature of God inspires insight and upright behavior. I emphasize this connection between practices of character formation and process of inculcating monotheistic conviction, showing how a proper conception of God's nature encourages meritorious conduct and vice versa in a self-perpetuating cycle. Henceforth, monotheism grounds morality in a single coherent and universal standard. Polytheism, by contrast, fragments moral authority across competing divine wills, resulting in inconsistency and ambiguity. An objection we can expect is that a polytheist could still affirm a universal moral standard even within a plurality of gods. But notice, to do that, they would have to appeal to some higher unifying standard that stands above all the gods. And once you admit that, the real moral authority is no longer the many, but the one, which starts to look a lot like monotheism. The moment you introduce a single standard that governs all gods, polytheism stops doing the real work. It's leaning on a monotheistic structure. And you'll notice this pattern repeats across other arguments as well. Each time coherence is needed, the system quietly imports a monotheistic framework. Without it, the view begins to lose its internal consistency.
So there's another point that I wanted to make sort of on like an explanation of how monotheism can lead to multiplicity. So if you imagine the first community, and you see this, if you watch any sort of like series or film that sort of shows a fledgling community as it grows over a long period of time, and then it gets so big that it becomes like, you know, a monster of its former self. You start with smaller communities, obviously they multiply, and they grow and they grow and they grow, and it gets to a point where like resources maybe become sparse, and they start thinking about how to find more resources. And they and then what you have is you have this sort of exploration group that splits off, like with the Vikings, for example. You had these villages where the people would settle in a place where there was spare land, and then they would sort of break it up between themselves, and they would become, like I say, a trading village or a fishing village. And then they would get this idea to maybe, let's go raiding, let's get on a boat, let's go explore. And so then they would go, to example, and they would sail west. They would find land there, you know, in particular the UK, Scotland, Ireland, you know, the east coast of the British Isles, and they would start by attacking there. They would get goods and take it back home and go, look what we found. And then eventually they would split, and numbers of this larger community would
Hmm.
like the idea, oh, there's all this extra land. Maybe it'll be a little bit less claustrophobic. We can settle. I can start afresh. And so then a part of this group moves away from the growing original group, and they start a new community elsewhere. And again, that grows. Now, sort of bringing this to the monotheism aspect, you've got the first monotheistic group, and they're settling, or they're nomads, or whatever it is that they're doing in the beginning. They find a place, and to begin with, they're gonna stay as a group. And at some point in time, the group is either going to have some sort of tension, or they're going to grow too big and they're going to have to split up, not necessarily for bad reasons, but just in terms of like the different possibilities that it could have happened. But either way, there's going to be, in a certain amount of time, some type of motivation for a part of the main group to split away and to move somewhere else. Yeah. And obviously, if you think about how big the earth is, if that split is done in a positive sense, they'd probably move to a location where they could still form some type of communication, and they could remain in contact and do trades and stuff, and help each other out. However, if it was a negative breakup, if the rebel group has the ability to overpower the original group, they will do, and in which case they'll still be one group and they'll just sort of like slaughter. But if for whatever reason the rebel group doesn't have the strength or the power to overwhelm the original group, they'll split and they'll try to move away, far away enough so that they aren't harassed or destroyed by the original group and seen as a competitor. And so they would need to put enough distance between them so they're not competing over the same resources. But that distance in time would also lead to a disconnection between them. Now, even if both of them are completely monotheistic, yeah, and like for whatever reason these groups split, if there's enough distance between them and enough time passes, and there's no development together, and there's no contamination of each other's cultures, as time moves forward, each generation brings along its new type of use of language, its way of words. You have these things like the great vowel shifts. So even the way things are said becomes very different. In the UK, a great example of that is like, it wasn't consciously, like the way I talk now in English, that wasn't consciously decided by individuals. Like, this is just how we're going to talk now. It was something that occurred slowly. There was like subtle differences. So, for example, there's a difference between how we, the English, say house. We have the ow, house, ow, ow. If you go to Scotland, they say hoose, hoose. They say their vowel is oo, not ow. And it's funny because hoose comes from the Nordic. So the Viking settlers, their word was hoose, hoose. And so that as well affected the way that all of the British people, and even Old English was closer to the Nordic way of saying it. The Old English was hoose, but in England there was a great vowel shift, and hoose became house. And it's something, I don't know if it means anything to the majority of the people that are watching this, but a vowel shift is just the way certain words are pronounced slowly transforms. And there's a lot of theory about why it happens, but it's not necessarily something conscious. And so you have this development of language and development of culture, and the different stories people might tell, and the different heroes that might emerge from each of these communities, and the way that they react to those heroes and try to quote unquote immortalize them or remember them might change drastically. Now, if there is enough time that passes between these multiple communities, their languages could become so distinct that even the way that they refer, even if there is only one God and they both believe there's only one God, the languages that they use to describe that one God might differ. If there's a rebellious group and they push away, they may do things reactionary in order to spite the original group. And so they may change things and then adapt stuff and come up with their own ideas. If the leaders of said communities have arrogance in them, or they see themselves as like almost worthy of worship, they have this sort of Iblisi mentality. It could be the case that they sort of try to completely reject the original religion and create
Right.
their own, where they become the god, quote unquote, and
Right.
the people are supposed to worship them. And you see that with like for
Yeah.
example,
Now I
Fir'aun.
understand the point. Yeah.
Yeah, Fir'aun is doing the same thing. And then if they bump into each other again, and then they meet later on, and their languages have developed, even if they both believe in one God, it might appear to them as if there's a multiplicity, and they will say, no, 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 our God is the true God. And the other community will say,
Right.
no, 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 our God is the true God. And
Makes sense.
they have different ways of expressing that religion. They might confuse it as being multiple gods. They could compete, say, our God has won your God, or like the Romans, they could incorporate those gods and start to multiply if they become confused over a long period of time. Obviously, you've got to think now over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, yeah, where you've got loads of communities growing and splitting up and moving into different locations and then traveling across an earth, yeah, and you've got communities that start developing all the way in the Americas, and they even in the Americas, like you could be split up on one side of America and on the other side, and never come across each other for hundreds of years because of the, like just of how difficult it might be. And there might be some little rebel that decides to try to break away and move west again, and he might bump into the old community and be like, oh, look at this, and rediscover things that were forgotten. And so like that, like you can see how the development of a multiplicity can transpire because of the rebellious nature of individuals or groups of people within a community, and how that can multiply or cause confusion when these groups reunite or find each other or discover each other again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, subhanallah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this would be, alhamdulillah, you highlighted another reason how, like, polytheism can come in, or something like monotheism can become more diverse, which may lead to polytheism or may lead to some conflict related to that. So yes, that is a very plausible explanation. As we were highlighting different explanations for why polytheism crops in, this is a very important and I think very useful explanation. If I remember correctly, I was having a discussion with Dr. Winfred Cordevan, and he was also explaining something like it's related. Polytheism cropping in can be related to the, or not worshipping one God can be related to the ego as well, the human ego. But now, if you believe in one God and morality or some kind of moral aspect stems from that God, or you try to ground that from God or ground that in God, then you have to, at least in some sense, submit. But a person who's very egoistic, or let's say he wants to become all sufficient in some sense, and this is one of the motivations why people become atheist as well, as they want to maximize the freedom to some extent. They might start rejecting God altogether, or reject the moral edict of God, and that again he might then carve a different pathway altogether for himself.
Yes,
which can also be another means of why polytheism might crop in. One is, again, people look for some shortcut in terms of their ritual or something like that to feel more happy, or to feel that they have fulfilled something, or to seek some kind of help. So these things are potential explanations. There can be more.
We're not exhausting it. We're just helping you.
Yes.
Because this is the thing. They're saying, okay, so how does it come to be then? If monotheism is a true religion in the beginning, how does that even occur? It's like, there's lots of ways. Like, and these are very, very, very good ways. Like, because if you do posit, and just take, like, say you're a skeptical person and you're trying to think about monotheism, and you're looking at the evidences in terms of, what's being provided empirically, just take what we've said and think about whether or not that makes sense. Yeah. If monotheism was the true religion in the beginning, and they were a verbal society, an oral society, they communicated and memorized words with their mouths, and they didn't write it down, they were against idol worship, would you expect to find empirical evidence? That's exactly. And if you don't find empirical evidence, that's not evidence against the existence. You can't then assert, oh, well, no, there mustn't have been one. No, that's an argument from silence. Yeah, that does not necessitate the non-existence of a monotheistic religion. In fact, that's exactly what you would expect if a anti-idol monotheistic religion that was not at the point where they were writing things down existed. Their places of worship would just be empty houses. That was it. It would just be a place to shelter their heads and stop the rain from getting to them. Yeah, and if they were nomads, they'd pack up and move, and you would find evidence of people living there. But you would just see a bunch of rooms. You just see a bunch of houses, a bunch of like places where structures used to exist. But it's like, this is an empty one. I don't know. Maybe they used to gather in this. Or things could have a multiplicity of purposes. They could do worship in their own homes. And again, like there might not necessarily be anything that they would need, because that's the beauty of Islam in particular, is the whole world is a masjid. Like you can pray wherever you want. You don't need anything.
Right.
I could be out, at a park, and it's like, oh, it's time for prayer, and I'll start to pray, and then I'll leave, and there's no evidence that I prayed. I don't leave anything behind. Yeah, and I can do that. I could travel the world and have to pray 5 times a day, and then if someone's following me, they would never find the evidence of me worshipping 5 times a day. There's no way for them to discover that, especially if I've memorized the Quran and I don't have a mushaf, a physical copy, and I don't, I've not got these like necklaces or these beads. And then even then, the beads, that just looks like jewelry. Like even if you like take these other little things that are sort of quote unquote religious relics or of some sort, like whatever you want to call them, religious items, when you see them, there are ways to interpret them differently and not necessarily in a religious nature. Like the prayer beads that people have to do dhikr. And then, Bismillah, 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 and they go through the beads. That just looks like a necklace. I could put that on and just bust about town and no one would know any different. They wouldn't necessarily input a religious nature to that thing, even if there was one. And so that's what you have to ask. Is that possible? Okay. And then if there is a one God religion and you get this sort of rebellion, I've seen that in people, in individuals today, where you like someone will rebel against their parents and they'll do something in spite of their parents because of the fact that they dislike them. Like, for example, with me and my father, my father was, a particular person. He used to do certain things. He used to litter. He'd smash bottles on the floor, and he's like, oh, give someone a job. I now have an anxiety in me. I can't drop litter. I can't do it. Like plastic bottles, maybe like fruit is maybe a little bit different because I'm thinking, it's fertilizer for the soil, so I'll make sure I put it near plants and stuff. But I can't. I'm never dropping a plastic bottle. Wallahi, you'll never see me drop a plastic bottle on the floor. I'll carry it with me forever, and like I'll get anxious if I see other people littering. It winds me up. Go on.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that. Just give me 2 minutes to summarize the article, and then like there are some
sorry. I go on these
2, 3, 4 things that I want to cover very swiftly.
Yeah.
So section 3 we covered. Section 4, I would just it's just about providing the Islamic perspective. So it might not be relevant for what we are trying to cover here, but what I wanted to show with the Islamic perspective is that, okay, so there are some tendencies where human beings can move towards polytheism, but one of the protection of that tendency would be if you have a strong tradition which does not allows you to worship anything other than the ultimate being. Like, because if you have something like, if you start worshipping things other than the ultimate being, you might in the long run start in some sense move towards polytheism. So that can be a tendency. So if there is a strong monotheistic foundation, then it can provide protection within the whole lineage from moving towards polytheism. That is one avenue that I try to cover, and I strove from an Islamic perspective. These things are expected. That but anyway, we are not touching on Islam now because this is not that section, so we can just skip that. Again, I also keep one section on epistemic humility when it comes to other beings, like what's about angel or something like that. From this perspective, as of now, we are just trying to navigate from a non-religious perspective. So the best position would be epistemic humility. When you make a very strong case that, oh yeah, there are other beings, or there aren't any other beings, those would be a very strong position. So other than that, now this is the important section. We can skip that. Now, before moving into this section, let's just talk about some of the virtues of monotheism, which sometimes we forget. Now, there is a lot of for example, let's say I've had a discussion with Dr. Justin Barrett. Now, he and many others along with him make a case that how science itself began, which we marvel at, it came from theists, but not just theists. It came from monotheism. Why? Because when you have an idea of a one singular creator, there's no chaos there. You have order, and from order stems the principle of uniformity. So even for the precondition of science is principle of uniformity, which presupposes that there is one order, there's one order to which all of nature consistently abides by, and that gives you something like science. So science as a method came from monotheism, and Justin Barrett and many others, they've argued that this birthed from the Abrahamic traditions, from Islam, from Christianity.
Those assumptions actually have served us reasonably well as touchstones for our moral systems, for our legal systems, for our political systems, and even for our sciences. It's often not noticed, but I think it's an important point that the people who invented modern science, by and large, were living in that intellectual space.
Right.
They accepted a lot of the assumptions of sort of a Christian or even Islamic worldview, right? That there's a God who has ordered the cosmos such that we can perceive that order. It's not completely chaotic, but there's some order. We're the kind of animal that could perceive order, even if dimly. Lots of how modern science has developed is actually built on the back of these theological assumptions.
I mean, now when we forget monotheism, again, the whole idea of principle of uniformity becomes questionable, because in the end, is there one ultimate foundation to which all laws of nature boil down to? So that's one virtue of monotheism, that science came from monotheism, and the ultimate grounding principle of science rests on a monotheistic idea. Second is, again, our understanding of morality, which we already covered, so I won't cover that. Again, Justin Barrett highlights and many others highlight that this idea of objective morality, the best grounding for it is monotheism. Under polytheism, you cannot have like objective ultimate grounding for objective morality. Again, that's a different question. Or objective morality, whatever, moral realism, moral facts, whatever you might call it. The third thing is, again, unity, having this kind of sense of unity, which might be linked to morality. Again, monotheism grounds that. There's one book by Big Gods by Aaron Aronzien. There are some inaccuracies there on his estimation, but overall, he makes a case of how within, if monotheism and polytheistic societies die out and monotheistic societies win over it. So it again points to some kind of intuitive aspect of within society has to run. Monotheism is far better than polytheism. Regardless, now the fifth and the most important thing, again, which is what I try to cover in the fifth section, which is primarily based on this book, Monotheism and Religious Diversity by Roger Trigg. This is a brilliant book. It talks about truth itself and what grounds truth. And he explains how the idea of objective truth itself, the best grounding for it is within monotheism. Because the idea of truth itself, like we used to have this idea of objective truth, and the grounding for it was actually monotheism. And I explain how. But then also one thing he mentions is how we reach these kind of relativistic ideas, and how objective truth has been relativized in some sense.
Yeah.
People don't believe in objective truth anymore. This, one of the reasons why that is because we've moved away from monotheism. He argues, he makes a brilliant case there. So so when it comes to diversity as well, like things like, as I mentioned, things like science and things like other things. So when we are truth seekers and we try to investigate truth, we already assume that there's one unity, there's one reality out there. Where many diverse cultures that are out there, we all have to find that one truth itself. So the truth itself has its own grounding in monotheism. And then I couple that with some philosophical arguments by Giuliano Keller and many others, who argue that if there are truths that are out there beyond the human mind, then you have to ground them. If there are necessary truths, then necessary truths have to be grounded in the necessary existence in some sense. Even Brother Jake made the argument which was similar to this with his debate with Aaron Ra, again, which was through propositions. But in the end, essentially, if you see the crux of it, what Giuliano Keller argues and what Brother Jake argues is that ultimate truth has to be grounded in the necessary being. And then what Roger Trigg is arguing is that truth has to be unity in some sense, and it has to be and monotheism provides the grounding for it. So if you combine both of that, you'll get an idea of how monotheism provides grounding for truth as well.
Yeah.
There can be, you can try to ground it in other ways, but then it won't be as coherent as monotheism. And that's what Giuliano Keller highlights, and there are some others who highlight. So overall, just let me summarize. So science itself is comes from monotheism, morality, unity, and truth. If you see all four of this, not five, it's four. So yeah, monotheism, when it comes to the virtues of monotheism, you see the best grounding for all these four within monotheism. Yeah, please go ahead. That's my article there. I'm done with my article.
Yeah, so touching on the relativity thing, so the relativity thing is a bit of a lazy shortcut. So, like for example, with moral relativity, first you have what's called DMR, which is descriptive moral relativism, and there's a similar thing with religion. So, like, there's a descriptive case for there being multiple religions around the world, multiple ideas about divinity. Yeah. So that's the descriptive element. That's not making a judgment about which one is true, which one isn't, which one might contain falsehood, so on and so forth. It's just, the scientific mind looks upon the world and then empirically documents what it sees. Yeah. So with regards to moral relativism, descriptive moral relativism says that there are multiple opinions about what is right and wrong and good and evil. And if you go to, the West, they've got different ideas about marriage than, say, the people in the East, and so on and so forth. There's varying ideas that are not identical to each other. And it's the same with religion. You look around the world, there are varying ideas about the divine. That's descriptive. That's all it is. That's not making a claim about whether or not they're true. And then there is this a tendency to jump from that to then make a truth claim about the legitimacy of everything that's within what has been described. And there's this modern tendency to, rather than assessing each one individually, to just make a meta claim and to jump, like, for example, from descriptive moral relativism to meta-ethical moral relativism, and to say there are multiple theories about what is right and wrong, about what good and evil is, so on and so forth. And so therefore, what is good and evil is society dependent, community dependent. Yeah, that, like, what is right for the British about having one partner, for example, it is right and it is true for them. Yeah, that what that is moral for that society or immoral for that society, because that is their norm and they experience it as such. So if someone has multiple wives, they look at that and think this is bad. And that is true for them within their context. And then it says, you look at the Eastern world, for example, where polygyny is not necessarily something that's looked down upon. And for them, moral relativism says that is fine. That isn't immoral, because for their community within their context, that's how it works. Now, that isn't something that's being proved. It's just an inference that they're making from the observation that there are multiplicities of ideas. And it's much easier to come to that conclusion than to have to go through the work of checking out each and every single one of them and trying to deduce if there's any truth. And it's also sort of underneath that, there is this assumption of they're all sort of, they're not, none of them are true in the absolute sense, that they don't really have like a legitimate claim. Like, for example, like Islamic ethics, the whole point of that is that it is linked to God, yeah, to Allah. Christian ethics, the whole point of that is that it is linked to God, yeah, to the creator of all things. And like, if the foundational point is true, then their ethics follows from that. But if you're looking at both of them and saying, no, that's true for this society, that's true for that society, and that it is true, like in a real sense, that they can say that this is moral or immoral, it's completely neglecting the question of whether or not they have a true connection to the divine. They're overlooking that. They're not even asking whether or not that's something that they need to consider. Yeah. They're just overlooking it. And with that, it's telling that there is this secular assumption at the bed of all of this. And then when they're going, or they're making the inference from DMR to MMR, from descriptive moral relativism to meta-ethical moral relativism, or from descriptive religious plurality to like a metaphysical religious plurality. When they're making these sort of absolute claims, there are assumptions at base in order to be able to make those claims in the first place. And again, I can't help but feel it's like a sort of lazy inference that they're making. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Sorry, I go on these
So
rambles.
no. So it's interesting. So you put that caveat, important caveat here. So I cover from like I was trying to cover from a very general angle. There are some nuances there, of course, which were like there's scope for people to have difference of opinion within those nuances as well. Regardless, now what I have to cover, let's go through what we have covered so far, making a case for the oneness of God. Within the rational case, we covered argument from exclusion, argument from conceptual differentiation, and Occam's razor. Within the intuitive case, we showed how monotheism is a deeply rooted intuition. It's simple and ultimate, and there's some bias within us towards high God concepts. Then, for the moral case, we showed how divine figures with evil or dubious moral characters can be a huge problem, and a clear ultimate grounding for morality and justice may be lacking in many polytheistic systems. Now, within the anthropological case, we covered debunking the popular narrative of monotheism evolving from animism and polytheism. We also made a case for original monotheism, and also we demonstrated how cultures possibly degenerate to polytheism, how polytheism is a degeneration from the original. Now, one thing to note within this case is that there are many anthropologists who still consider monotheism to be an invention by advanced civilization. However, ample of evidence has been provided to show that's not the case. The belief in high God is not restricted to advanced civilizations but also found in the most primitive hunter gatherer tribes. Take the example of the Andamanese tribe from North Sentinel Island, who is one of the most isolated tribes and has hardly received any human contact over the years. When we investigate their beliefs, we see they believed in a supreme being who was invisible. The supreme being is without beginning and end. The supreme being created everything, including the first couple, and so on, which is very close to monotheism. Such a pattern is not unique to the Andamanese. Rather, Daniel highlights how the high god is seen to have the following attributes in most cases among the primitive tribes, which is omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipotence, creative power, and morality. Dr. Winfred Kodeman also notes a common pattern which again resembles closeness to monotheism. The patterns are listed here. Now, there are many others who still think, despite the existence of high god in many primitive tribes, we cannot derive which belief is the original belief. It is true that the belief in high god seems to categorize the oldest cultures, but we also find there other religious elements. As far as we can reconstruct the most remote past, it is safer to assume that religious life was from the very beginning rather complex, and that elevated ideas coexisted with lower forms of worship and belief. In today's time, most anthropologists don't pay attention to Wilhelm Schmidt's formulations, and some are even dismissive towards it. Have a look at the following video.
Up until about the 1930s, you can say late 1800s, get more hot in the 1930s. But after Wilhelm Schmidt published his piece on original monotheism, the evolutionist schools, some of them responded. As we see, the responses are not sufficient at all, and nothing even approaching to the standard of the work of Wilhelm Schmidt or Stephen Langdon. They're based on a priori assumptions and desires. Some responses are more technical, but those responses have also been refuted. But basically, not long after Schmidt published his work, this was just totally left alone by the evolutionists, and it's lying under the carpet, so to speak.
Okay.
And there's now a pile of dust on top of it and rubbish and rubble, which has to be cleared away.
Considering Smith's meticulous documentation, which involves multiple volumes of empirical data, so far no work is even at par with his standing. Despite the criticism, the cultural historical method remains a plausible approach for inferring the earliest culture of humankind discernible to us. Schmidt posits Comparing the primitive cultures with the later ones, we may lay down the general principle that is none of the latter is the supreme being to be found in so clear or definite, vivid, and direct a form as among people belonging to the former. We may now proceed to supplement this by another of no less importance. This supreme being is to be found among all the people of the primitive cultures, not indeed everywhere in the same form, but still everywhere prominent enough to make his dominant position indubitable. Consequently, Schmidt's original monotheism thesis can be considered at the very least as a suggestive evidence to our overall case for the oneness of God. Now we move on to grounding, order, and truth. Here we highlighted how there is one order manifesting within the universe, and this order makes more sense under monotheism. Even the modern scientific method presupposes this order. And then grounding of truth itself. On a practical and social level, monotheism offers the grounding for truth. Relativity emerges when we move away from this view, as Roger Trigg has highlighted. Even when we move into the metaphysics of truth makers or grounding of true propositions, we get the same result. Under practical considerations we covered, monotheism provides better sense of equality, unity, and coherence, and it's even functionally better for large-scale societies when compared to polytheistic systems. What's very important to note is that for this part of the Goraps series, we are not required to cover so much ground. Only the rational case for the oneness of God is enough to fulfill the O of Goraps. All the rest arguments are suggestive arguments, and if someone is not convinced by any one of these suggestive arguments or has disagreements, that's fine. It still does not affect our overall establishing of the oneness of God. Essentially, what's left to unpack before ending this episode is covering a bit more on the rational case, throwing some light on omnipotence and divine perfection, plus covering some psychological considerations and a comparative analysis. So I just want to stress a bit more on divine perfection, which has to be one. I can stress on that. I had some things to cover that, and then we can end the discussion. There's one more video that I want to play.
I might need to get going now. So do you need me for this bit, or would you be all right?
No problem. No problem. Inshallah, I'll cover this. Yeah.
Okay.
Jazakallah khair.
It's a pleasure as always.
Yeah, I enjoyed a lot. I mean, many of the things that you mentioned, they are stuck in my head. So like overall, I think you know what I feel at this point is that, we are beating a dead horse. In terms of making a strong case for monotheism. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So people from different perspective, appreciate different types of arguments. So that's why I'm trying to cover many different angles.
So when we're beating that dead horse, like one part of it might satisfy one group of people, but not another.
Exactly.
And so then obviously if we continue to beat that horse, eventually the hope is that whoever's watching this, ultimately we should cover everyone by the end of it. That's the dream. So
inshallah.
As well, so just to sort of, I want to try and get in the habit of reminding people about this. Both me and Khalid, we work with Lighthouse Mentoring, and we're mentors. So the service is set up to help people who doubt Islam is true and are maybe interested in having these conversations. It's private, it's free, and you can just book a meeting by going to lighthousementoring.org. And when you go to the website, you can just pick a time and a day that suits you, book a meeting with one of the mentors and have a chat. That's whether you're a born Muslim that's been doubting Islam or that wants to discuss these things, or you've got some sort of shubuhat, some worries or some concerns that make you fear that Islam might not be true. You could be a new Muslim that's sort of wobbly with your faith, an ex-Muslim thinking about returning, or a non-Muslim considering and being open to the idea that Islam might be true. And if you fall into any of those categories and you do want to talk to someone in private, please feel free to just check out the website, lighthousementoring.org, and book a meeting through there. And you'll either speak to myself or Khalid or one of our colleagues, inshallah. But I'll leave it there. I'm going to run. It's been a pleasure, and we'll talk again soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yeah, so we are back with covering, I think, moral perfection, or a few things that I just want to touch on in case if I've missed out, because there are many more arguments for one God. Let me bring one interesting. So this book by Muhammad Hijab, I think, covers 3 different arguments for the oneness of God. And let me see if I can cover any of this. So the first argument is about how necessary being cannot be more than one way. I mean, those who want to go a bit more deeper, they can read the book. You can find it free, PDF of the book. You can get it online on the Sapiens website. The second one, I think it's too long. I won't cover it. Anyone can go there and check. And the third is, for nature to be stable, uniform, and regular, there must only be one external agent arranging the world. Again, I think this is a Quranic argument, if I'm not mistaken. Nature is stable, uniform, and regular. I think this builds on the science argument. Like, this is the precursor for whole science itself, for the uniformity of nature. We see only one will manifesting. Even if you say, oh, there might be some two wills compromising. Again, if you say that there are two wills compromising, a divine, omnipotent, maximally perfect being does not compromise. So from that perspective, that being cannot be almighty. From that perspective, if you see one will manifesting and we've already made a case for a perfect being, then that perfect being has to be one in that sense. And nature is stable and uniform and regular. Therefore, there must be only one external agent arranging the world. Yeah, so that makes sense. We can move to some more arguments. Now, I might bring in some sources. Does not mean I endorse the source entirely. I might just bring that small nugget that I found interesting, and that's what I want to share. So let's bring this in. This was by Alexander Proust in his argument from contingency argument. When he builds the contingency argument, in one section, he makes a case for why that being has to be one. He says that can there be an omnipotent collective? It is tempting to quip that there is a conceptual impossibility in a committee being omnipotent, since some committees always suffer from impotence. So, due to the interaction issues within the committee, there may be something to the quip. How, after all, could a collectively be omnipotent? How would the powers of the individuals interact with one another? Would some individuals have the power to prevent the functioning of others? There are different questions. It seems simpler to posit a single being. Again, when he develops the contingency argument, he shows Alexander proves that that being has to be one. There's one more very interesting thing that I want to cover. This is by Richard Swinburne. Could there be more than one divine being? And he says that, Duns Scotus has an argument against the possibility of there being more than one omnipotent being. If two omnipotent beings exist, each will make the other impotent. Not indeed by destroying the other, but because one has his positive will, could keep non-existence what the other wills should exist. You see, there is an issue with omnipotence. You bring in two omnipotent beings directly, it adds on a limit. But an omnipotent being, by definition, it has unlimited power in that sense. So if an omnipotent being has unlimited power, as soon as you bring in another omnipotent being, the will gets limited, because then there is another will in competition from that perspective. So omnipotence itself, just by omnipotence itself, it is very much plausible to make a case that there can only be one omnipotent being. As soon as you put another one, again, there becomes an omnipotent paradox in some sense. So if there is an omnipotent paradox related to that, like, about the wills and stuff, which are going back to the first few arguments that we covered, and that's an issue which you cannot solve. So it's always better to have a simple explanation. It's always better to have a coherent explanation. Whereas when you posit these beings, they create far more problems than they solve. And sometimes they even end up in contradictions as well. One more important video that I want to highlight is from Thought Adventure podcast. This video, I think, is very good, which covers many of these arguments that we have highlighted. Sometimes in more depth, sometimes in passing, they mention it. But yeah, that is a useful resource for someone who's going deeper into it. Another one that I want to cover, as I wanted to mention, moral perfection. Sorry, more when as I said, I wanted to cover perfection itself. If you believe in a perfect being, the perfect being, then the perfection itself entails that being has to be one. There's one argument again that in passing also mentions how when you make a case for God's perfection, God, the greatest being, like for example, when you make a case for God's existence, we can also incorporate the ontological argument, the greatest possible being, and that also entails that there is exactly one supreme being that exists. I won't go in depth trying to cover that. And let's say that if someone talks about two supreme beings who are perfect in some sense, again, there's one more argument where how do you differentiate them? Yeah, so this book, Necessary Existence and Monotheism, is actually trying to establish monotheism from necessary existence. So I don't agree with everything the book says. But yeah, this one section I found was interesting. So this again would try to build on there cannot be two necessary beings. Again, if because you have to individuate them, and if that individuation itself is based on it being necessary, there can only be one necessary being. So that you're talking about that one being twice, but it's only one. If the individuation is just based on something necessary, that it being a necessary being, then there is no necessary being existent other than it. There can only be one from that perspective ultimately. But that if the individuation is based on something else other than the necessary being, the necessary existence, then it is caused in some sense. So that would create another problem. So from that perspective, again, you only end up with one necessary being, ultimately one necessary being. You cannot have more than one ultimate necessary being. So yeah, that's something interesting that I thought I could cover. There's a lot more, but I don't think we need to cover all of that. What I can end this discussion with is again one more interesting fact. So we've seen from a intuitive angle, from a Fitri angle, monotheism makes more sense. From a rational perspective, monotheism makes more sense. Other perspectives fail. And from a virtue perspective also, how society should run, how science works, how truth works, and many other uh, ways we can see how monotheism provides the best grounding for all of this. But there's one more. I just wanted to cover belief in monotheism versus belief in polytheism, what impact it has on us. And that's also very interesting. So I'm going to start playing a video, and maybe that might help. So this is just maybe more on a practical psychological perspective. Maybe the last section that I can cover is this.
Because otherwise, anxiety comes when your focus is. I said to him something quite interesting about what the Quran proposes, that if you believe in one God, that you'll be tranquil and you'll be content and so on. He said, yeah, this is the case, because otherwise anxiety comes when your focus is multiplicitous. I found that very interesting. If you believe in more than one thing, your focus becomes multiplicitous, and that creates a sense of anxiety. And I think that was a key moment in the discussion I had with him, because him, from a psychological perspective, is almost affirming the fact that having a solid belief in one God worthy of worship can put you in a tranquil and peaceful state. And that's what I think is, because one video of Jordan Peterson, which I found really interesting, which is not as popular, but is where he talks about happiness. And happiness ain't the goal, because, and he mentions this in the video, he says that if you're always in that elevated state, it wouldn't actually be a healthy disposition to be in. So the question is then, what state should we be in most often? The answer that Islam gives is that we should be in a tranquil state, in a content state, in a satisfied state. You're always content, you're always in peace. You can be happy from time to time, like you can have bouts of euphoria and ecstasy and all that kind of stuff from time to time. But if that's always the case, then it's like being manic.
Yeah, again, so but this might bring in the Islamic perspective, but keeping that aside as well, what he mentioned was interesting. So monotheism brings in tranquility, and polytheism brings in some kind of anxiety. And he was talking about Jordan Peterson. He had a discussion with him. So where he also affirms that yes, monotheism brings some kind of satisfaction, some kind of tranquility, which you don't get under polytheism. Rather, under polytheism, it can bring in more anxiety. And think about what polytheism does. It does not give you one center, it gives you many gods, many wills, many powers, many directions. And with that comes a kind of existential fragmentation. What do you turn to? Which god is in control? Which will prevails? And what happens when they conflict? Polytheistic systems are inherently unstable. They bring in instability and anxiety. Polytheistic systems are inherently unstable since individual cults are in constant competition with one another, both for limited resources and for worshippers. These defunct polytheisms offered little cheer, less comfort, and no consolation. The traditional Greek and Roman gods could hear prayers, but it was rather uncertain whether they would care. It was wise to appropriate such gods with periodic rituals and sacrifices, but they were not very loving and more often seemed to provoke anxiety than to have been loved. At times, these gods are insecure themselves. Whatever dynasty happens to be in power right now could at any moment be replaced by another. No wonder the gods feel a bit insecure. Most importantly, they are only marginally concerned with the welfare of human beings. Under polytheism, gods barely care about humans, and that gets more clear when you see how polytheistic systems have a transactional nature. Polytheistic systems are based on the principle of reciprocity, and whatever God wants is something materialistic like a nice big statue made of bronze, silver, or even gold. By contrast, the Abrahamic God is concerned with good behavior. Plus, in many cases, the gods must be bribed. Polytheistic gods have better things to do than concern themselves with the plight of humans, which means you have to give them an offering to make a sacrifice to get their attention. However, the Abrahamic God, God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is always available. Even Jordan Paper admits under polytheistic systems, temples are built for deities in exchange for being helpful. Let's move on to death and afterlife under this comparison. Under ancient polytheisms, they often offer gloomy afterlife. The focus is more on the present life. Comparatively, monotheism is more focused on heaven and hell, moral judgment, eternal destiny. Now let's compare how God is contacted within these systems. Under monotheism, there is direct access to God, no need for bribes. Under polytheism, however, gods must be persuaded. Wealth matters, physical proximity helps. Polytheistic gods have better things to do than concern themselves with the plight of humans, which means you have to give them an offering or a sacrifice to get their attention. However, the Abrahamic God, the God of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is always available. Garland also highlights monotheism, of course, pray to one God. He's always listening and he's always available. You don't have to be in a temple, synagogue, or church, and your prayer won't be any more effective if you are. Nor does it matter whether you are a member of a royal family, a bishop, or just an average Jew. You have equal access to divine. For polytheists, it's much harder. First, there are many gods and goddesses, and getting in touch with one you want may be difficult. Second, your status actually does make a difference. A deity is much likely to heed your petition if you are wealthy because there's the expectation that you will give them something back. Third, polytheistic deities aren't particularly concerned about mere mortals. And finally, it helps to be in close physical proximity to the deity. If you were an ordinary Egyptian, for example, and you wanted to pray to a major deity, you had to go to the outer walls of a temple. There would be a sculpture representation of a pair of cars called chapel of the earring ear. And you'd whisper your prayer into the pair of ears. You couldn't get any closer because you weren't allowed inside the temple. If contacting major Egyptian gods posed a challenge, you could, however, pray to a domestic deity. Such gods didn't reside in big temples. They were happy to visit your home and were therefore much more approachable. Now compare this with monotheism. You are not calling into a fragmented cosmos. You are turning to one God who's fully aware, fully present, always listening. No intermediaries are required, no competition, no confusion. You don't need status, you don't need wealth, you don't need proximity. The poorest person and the most powerful ruler stand exactly the same before God. And more than that, you are not trying to get his attention, he already knows. You are not trying to reach him, he is already near. And more than that, in monotheism, every single blessing in your life is traced back to one source. The air you breathe, the food you eat, the heart beating in your chest, all of it comes from one God. And when all goodness comes from one, your love is no longer divided. Your gratitude is no longer scattered. It is directed fully, completely to Him. And that creates something powerful, an avenue for a relationship built on deep love, gratitude, and devotion. However, under polytheism, there are gods that require offering, gods that depend on ritual, that rely on human acts to maintain their favor. Can a God that depends on you truly be the one you depend on? Monotheism, on the other hand, transforms this entirely because when you believe in one all powerful God, the one who controls everything, the one who knows all that is hidden and apparent. You don't negotiate with him, nor do you manage him. You submit. And in that submission, there is clarity, there is stability, and there is peace. Think about this. Polytheism gives you a world where the divine itself is divided. And if the ultimate reality is divided, then your heart will be divided. Your loyalties will be pulled apart, your hopes will be scattered, and ultimately your peace will be divided. But monotheism does something extraordinary. It unifies reality at the highest level. And when reality is one, your direction becomes one, your purpose becomes one. Since polytheism gives you a fragmented universe, at the end, it gives you a fragmented heart. At the deepest level, religion is about what philosophers call ultimate concern, something so real, so valuable that everything else becomes secondary. But that kind of total devotion only truly makes sense if its object is one and truly the ultimate. If one's ultimate concern is divided amongst the limited, then it is no longer ultimate. And this is why monotheism does not just make sense intellectually, it transforms the human experience entirely. Monotheism becomes an existential anchor because it gives you something polytheism never can: a single source of truth, a single source of morality, a single source of meaning, and a single refuge for the human heart. Many gods may give many options, but they cannot give you peace, because peace does not come from multiplicity, it comes from unity. One God, one reality, one ultimate grounding of everything that is true, good, and meaningful. Now, you have another avenue here, which again shows how monotheism trumps over polytheism. In every avenue in our human nature, I believe, in terms of satisfaction, monotheism wins. In terms of reasoning, logic, monotheism trumps over it. From our intuitive perspective, again, monotheism trumps over it. From a practical perspective, again, you see monotheism trumps over it. So you see, in every scenario, monotheism makes more sense. And this is where I can end with one quote that I find to be somewhat interesting. So we can end the O of the Gorap series with this quote, which I find very interesting. The history of religion in general and the history of monotheism in particular shows us that believing in God alone is the only conclusive answer for each and every question about the origin of the universe and humanity and the purpose of their existence. For there could never be any aim of human life except if there was a God, and every human religiosity originally refers back, whether being consciously aware of it or not, to the belief in one God. So, with that, I think we can end our O of Goraps. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. Let us know what do you feel after, like, what are your thoughts about after going through this entire discussion, inshallah. For now, we can see you back with the R of Goraps, inshallah. For the R of Goraps will be Revelation, inshallah. We'll try to cover that, and we have a lot of interesting things coming up, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.